Hello, fellow innovators. This is Patrick Emmons.
And this is Shelli Nelson.
Welcome to the Innovation and the Digital Enterprise Podcast, where we interview successful visionaries and leaders, giving you an insight into how they drive and support innovation within their organizations.
We're very excited to have Kristi Zuhlke with us today. Kristi is an entrepreneur, idea generator, and global consumer insights and strategy expert with 6 years of proven strategic leadership experience at Procter & Gamble and a 3-time company founder. Both Patrick and I are very excited about having her with us today.
Hi, Kristi. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So, Kristi, just to kick it off, would you mind sharing with our audience what the idea was behind KnowledgeHound? How did you come to create that company?
Yeah, absolutely. So I started my career at Procter & Gamble. So P&G makes brands such as Tide, Gillette, Bounty. So major household brand names that you're probably familiar with. And I had the privilege of working on several of their brands and in a role that was a bit of a hybrid between marketing and market research. So it was my job to be the voice of the consumer in all of the decisions that we would make on these brands. So, for example, I'd worked on Gillette for a while, and marketing would come and say, here's the new Gillette advertisement. And it was my job to say, he's going to love it, he's going to hate it. We need to talk about this benefit instead of this other one for him to resonate with this. And if I didn't know the answer to that, I would go and field market research to then come back and help the company make a new strategic decision on our marketing or go to market plan or whatever it may be that was very much consumer centric. And so through that experience, I experienced a pain point. And that was I would be in a meeting, just as the example I gave you, and the team would come to me with a question, and I would know we knew the answer because we'd spent millions of dollars in the past researching various topics. And yet I didn't have a way to access the data that we already had. So, for example, I might be in a meeting and someone might say, hey, Kristi, what percent of people use a shampoo and conditioner when washing their hair? I'm sure we've asked that plenty of times, but I really didn't have the answer at my fingertips. I'd have to go back and figure out where we had it. And so in my mind, I thought, wow, what if we had this Google-like experience, but for our data? So not searching documents and PowerPoints necessarily. I could do that with my share drive. But what if we could actually search data? And so that's where I got this idea for KnowledgeHound. So KnowledgeHound is a hybrid between Google-like search and Tableau-type visualization for the market research world. So our clients are Fortune 1000 companies who are spending some money or a lot of money in market research and understanding their consumers.
Wow, that's great. Thanks. And I do remember when we spoke a while back, I thought right out of college you had wanted to start your own business and you had a mentor at that time who encouraged you to go into the corporate world. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I've always known I wanted to be an entrepreneur. I started in high school. I actually started a journal that I have to this day that has all my different business ideas in them. And so when I was looking at colleges, I picked a university that at the time had and still does have a major in entrepreneurship. At that time in 2001, it was very rare to actually find a college with an entrepreneurship major. And I chose to go to Xavier University because one of the reasons was because of this major. And so I actually went to school to learn what are the struggles of entrepreneurs, how to overcome those barriers, et cetera. And I started my first business when I was in college. And because of that, I sat on the board of entrepreneurship for the university. And I sat on that board among very accomplished entrepreneurs and then also very accomplished entrepreneurs. And entrepreneurship is really a term that means within a large company, how do you act and think entrepreneurial? And I met this woman who at the time worked at P&G, and she said, Kristi, what are you going to do when you graduate? And I said, well, I'm definitely going to go start another company. And she was like, okay, well, what are you going to start? And I said, well, I don't really know yet, but it's going to be something. And she gave me some really great advice that changed my life for, the path at least that I would go down in life to start with, which was, she said, listen, why don't you come to P&G and you can work on billion-dollar brands, learn how large organizations are run, learn how to be a critical thinker and a leader, and have this as your playing ground for mentorship and growth, and then go start a business. And I thought that was a really good idea. Why should I just jump right into entrepreneurship when I was probably pretty naive about a lot of ways that a company could be run? And so that's what I did. I left, I graduated from Xavier and I joined Procter and Gamble, and I was there for 6 years. And I was a sponge. I was there with a mindset of how do you run a company, which is a bit rare for people going into corporate America, but it was a wonderful experience. I'm so glad I did it. It gave me my business idea that I have been working on today, and an amazing network of people.
Wow, that's great. And do you feel like that experience changed the way that you mentor entrepreneurs today?
For sure. Absolutely. In a couple different ways. One is that I talk to a lot of future entrepreneurs or aspiring entrepreneurs who are in corporate America today. And one of the questions they almost always ask is, how did you make the decision to leave your corporate job to start a company? And most of it is around the question of security. How do you go from a world that's very secure, where your paycheck shows up magically in your checking account twice a month, where the risk is so much lower? And how do you just mentally get over that hurdle of saying, okay, I'm going to leave that all behind, and the next day, I'm not going to know where my paycheck is going to come from? And so there's a lot of that mentorship that goes into talking with aspiring entrepreneurs. And then current entrepreneurs who've never worked in the corporate world often will talk about, how are these large organizations run? What are the politics involved? What are the forces that are happening inside these large organizations that those of us who aren't inside the company can't possibly understand? Why aren't deals going through? And who do I need to align inside of a large organization? It's just a lot of mentorship around that structure and experience of being inside of a large organization, that if you've never were, you don't understand all the nuances that take place to get a deal done, or to get a partnership secured, or an investment secured.
I gotta be honest, part of what I can't get my mind out of is that notebook. What are some of the other ideas that you had way back when? Like, what is the craziest idea that you had in your notebook about things that you were going to do? Do you remember?
Well, yeah, I definitely do. A few of them have come to light in the world. So one is this whole idea that before you go into a grocery store, you actually send a list of all of your groceries that you wanted to buy. And when you got to the store, you'd have a device on your shopping cart, and it would map out the entire store and show you where everything was on the aisle. And you could then would be coupons, so that would lead you to new types of products that you might enjoy that were complimentary, or that might go with your pasta. Here's the wine section, and help you shop as you went. And then you would check out as you would go. Now, this idea I wrote down when I was, I believe, a junior. So this in high school. So this was 1999. So this is about, what is that? Like, 8, 9 years probably before the first iPhone came out, true smartphone came out. So I
Absolutely.
had this
Yeah.
vision of some heavy hardware that was required to get this done. But it's a bit of Instacart plus iPhone plus self-checkout all together. So that was one of those ideas that I'm like, oh yeah, well, I already thought of that.
Well, and to keep the context of the time, I mean, in 98, 99, Amazon was not what it is today, right?
No,
So
yeah,
Amazon back then was one of many, many e-commerce plays. It was not the one, you know, Amazon. So it that's very interesting. I'm intrigued with the concept of, going to school to be an entrepreneur. What is about entrepreneurship that gets you excited? What is it that creates that passion in you?
I really think it is this passion for creating something new and identifying a problem and knowing that I could fix it. I don't see a lot of barriers. So there's some people in this world, and I think it's a bit genetic, honestly. So there's people in this world who look at a problem and go, ugh, like if only I could have this and this. And they think of all the reasons why it's impossible to have that. So, for example, autonomous driving vehicles, I think is a great example of someone saying, you know what, this needs to happen and it's going to happen. And then the majority of the population saying, there's no possible way that that could happen. You'd have to have, how are you going to get all the cars that don't have autonomous driving onto the road? How does it not hit people? How do there's a laundry list of things of why autonomous driving vehicles won't work. But the way my brain works is that I think through, instead, I don't see that laundry list of all the reasons why it can't happen. I see all the reasons why it should happen. And I even think back to, Henry Ford and creating a car that anyone can drive. There's so many reasons why someone at that time would say that wouldn't work. So you'd have to have the infrastructure. What happens when you come to an intersection? Are people going to hit each other? What happens when you have a pedestrian? There's so many reasons why cars should never have been invented. And think of how much money right now fuels our economy just by keeping up our infrastructure for cars. It's pretty amazing. And so why can't you develop that for autonomous driving vehicles? But that parallels into any new innovation for me. So it's like, why can't you create a new skin cream? Of course you can. Why can't you create a technology that is a blend between Google and Tableau? Of course you can. It's a lot just about right timing, product market fit, the right people on board in your organization, getting investors to invest. I mean, there's so many barriers to overcome, but at the same time, it's not impossible.
Yeah, you touch on a great point around innovation. And one of the automobile industry, I'm not sure everybody's aware, but the amount of regulations that they tried to slow down automobiles, right? Many states, many municipalities had a lot of rules that if you came to an intersection, one in fact required that if you were operating a car, you stopped and fired off a gun to notify everybody that you were coming through an intersection. But that's what happens when you mess with, the big horsewhip industry. They're just, they're a power voting block in the Congress, and so you got to deal with those types of large players in your industry. So I really just want to use the phrase "big horsewhip industry."
Yeah, yeah, that's
I've been
good.
sitting on that for a while. It's been incubating. Felt like the right time. But yeah, it's very interesting, and I do wonder. A lot of people when I talk to them, they talk about like, oh, I've always thought about doing it. I should have, or I would have, or I might have, or a lot of those things. And I think for a lot of people, it's more accidental, maybe intentionally accidental, right? Like I fully intended to do it, or I always thought I would. And then all of a sudden a window of opportunity presented itself. So one of the thoughts that I think people struggle with, like, am I an entrepreneur? Am I an entrepreneur? Am I wired for this kind of thing? I think a lot of times people put this label on folks as being optimists, right? Like, would you consider yourself like an optimist or a pessimist, and I really won't accept the term realist because that requires knowing what the truth is. And since no one has that, I just think that's kind of like a half baked pessimist who just doesn't want to admit that they're a pessimist. So, but I guess, like from your perspective, are you an optimist? Are you optimistic, or what is that like personality type to be able to go into a situation where it's like, yes, there's a lot of headwinds and there's a lot of potential for failure, and there's a lot of negative outcomes that are perceived. And I think perception is an important part of that. So I guess, yeah, optimist, pessimist. What does that mean? How do you think that feels for you?
I'm absolutely an optimist. I am a passionate optimist, though. So, what has to happen as an entrepreneur is that you have to feel so passionate about solving a problem that you're willing to get up every morning and fight for solving it. And I believe there's a lot of optimists in this world, but you have to have this combination of optimism and passion to solve a problem. Now, optimism will get you so far. There is a need for pessimists inside of a growing company. And so, really, where I've struggled and where I've had to retrain myself is moving from the transition from founder to CEO. And founders tend to be very optimistic, passionate people about solving a particular problem. And then once you gain venture funding, or once things start not going exactly as your forecast predicted, you have to turn yourself into a pessimist and be able to critically think through what is going wrong. And that takes time to retrain your brain because you feel, one, so passionate about what you're doing. So, of course, there couldn't be anything wrong with it. And second, you're an optimist. So you think, you know what, next quarter, it'll be better. Next quarter will be fine. And when it's not, it's really hard to then get your head wrapped around, how can I look at this a little bit more critically and be more critical of this business that I've been so passionate about and that I've sold the vision to all of my employees, all of my venture capitalists, all the people that I've pitched, my family, my spouse, my grandma, like everyone. And
Grandma's always an easy sell. I
she
mean, if
is.
I honestly, right? If I was in Cook County, my grandma would be bragging I was like prisoner of the month, right? Like, Pat's doing great down in county. It's
Yeah,
awesome.
he's he's the rising star inside
That's
the
right.
four walls.
That's right.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, grandma's the easy sell, but as soon as you raise money or as soon as you have got these goals that you communicate to your organization, things aren't going to go right. And so you have to train yourself to think a little bit different, which can be hard for someone who is an optimist like I am. But for sure, I'm an optimist. My husband he's a pessimist. I do hate that word because it sounds negative. He's not negative. He is so black and white, and he's a great balance to me. I think we'd be great business partners someday. But it's so refreshing though, because you need those people inside your organization as an entrepreneur. You need to actually hire them, those people who are going to help you see the opposite side of the coin and say, you know what, though there's opportunity over here and we could be doing this better, instead of, this is great, let's just do more of this and more of that.
So, and that's a great comment. And I would say, having been married through starting 3 different companies, your spouse is a business partner. that's already a foregone conclusion from my perspective,
Yeah.
right? Like, you guys are wired together. But I guess that does lead to the other question is, that yin and yang that you mentioned. Is there somebody in your organization that plays that role for you on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, an interesting case where I had a technical co-founder, and he was very technical. He was a developer, and so it wasn't necessarily the right role for him to scale as an operator inside the organization. And so I've really had to play both roles, operator and CEO, for quite a while. But now I've been able to hire enough folks around me and promote folks into more operational type roles who've been able to over time take quite a bit off my plate so that I can exercise much more of my strength, which is the visionary piece, the sales side of me. And it's interesting too, you look at some CEOs and they're very operational CEOs. They love to get into the details. They love to talk through processes and optimize processes within inside the organization. Whereas other CEOs like myself, we're much more externally facing, we're sales oriented, and making sure that you hire people that complement you is really critical. And I've been able to do that within inside the organization, thankfully.
Yeah, I think you touch on a really important issue of the difference between founders and managers, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think somebody who has a sales marketing background can bridge that gap to a certain degree. But I do think when you see a lot of people who are promoted to CEO more through the operational branch, you get more risk mitigation than growth perspective and selling and outward activities. And too often I find those types of leaders view sales somewhat as a dirty part of the business, right? It's not something that they can control. It's not something that they can put into a spreadsheet and draw a straight line across. And I do think that is one of the most powerful aspects of founder-led organizations is that the founder at the beginning took whatever resources they had around, turned it into something of value to somebody else, and turned it into value for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a trick, a magic trick all into itself. So one other thought, I getting back to the optimism, pessimism. Are you familiar with the Stockdale Paradox from Good to Great?
I read the book a while ago, but I can't remember what the paradox is about. Remind me.
Yeah, so Stockdale was he was a pilot during the Vietnam War. He was stuck in prison for a very long time, and obviously went through some unimaginable experiences. And he never broke through this whole time. And when Jim Collins was interviewing him, he said, "Well, how did you get through all this and you didn't break?" And he's like, "Well, I knew I was going to win." And he's like, "Oh, you're an optimist." And he's like, "No, the optimists are the first ones gone
Hmm.
because they have this concept that things are just going to work out. I knew I was going to win, but I knew it was going to be hard."
Yeah.
And I think that's part of the challenge I see with a lot of people who start that path of either entrepreneurship is not understanding that it's possible, but it's going to take a lot of endurance. It's going to take a lot of will, and it's going to take a lot of dealing with setbacks. And I guess, you're in fourth year now with KnowledgeHound. Is that correct?
6 years. Yeah.
Six. Sorry, forgive me. So yeah, so you're well. So I always see that 3-4 years is kind of like that. You've got to get through those first 3 years, 4 years to just even feel somewhat safe that
For sure.
this is going to work.
Yeah. Yes. And if you're doing your job, you're constantly paranoid. So at any moment you feel like the business could go away. And I've talked to CEOs of companies that are 70 million and 100 million, and they'll say, Kristi, it never ends. You always feel as though there are catastrophes inside the organization. And going back a little bit to the good to great example, I don't agree that optimism has to be something different than grit or that they can't go together. So I do think you can be an optimist and have an amazing amount of grit and be a realist. And so I don't know, as though you're stuck in a cell and you're going, yeah, I'm going to win. I think optimists have some of us have a very similar mentality. And you almost have to have that optimism to say, yeah, I'm going to get through this. And it's more so grit, in my opinion, than anything else. But there's also something to be said. There's for sure the set of entrepreneurs who don't have the grit, or the aspiring entrepreneurs who they don't have the grit to make it through, because it takes 3, 4, 5 years. There's some companies I've heard takes 10 years to really get to a breakthrough point. And that takes grit to get through that. But also you could argue that those entrepreneurs, some of them are really brilliant, that recognize 2 years in, listen, this isn't working. I'm going to go to a different business idea that's a lot easier to do, that has maybe better product market fit, that I can spend my resources again. So I think some people could look at me and say, you're 6 years in and you're a company of 20 people, you should be 200. You've got grit and you're stubborn and you're an optimist, and those are all great things. But at the same time, give it up already and go do something that's going to be a billion-dollar company tomorrow. Or other people could look at me and say, wow, you really toughed it out. You know what it's like to be an entrepreneur. So I don't think there's a right or wrong way to do this. But it does, you're right, it does take this stubborn grit, optimism, I mean, all kinds of emotions and personalities to on a daily basis to get through it.
That's a good point.
I agree with you. Yeah, 100%. The one phrase I always go back to is just don't quit.
Yeah.
Right? You can fail. That's okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? Like my wife said that to me one time. She's like, it's okay. You can fail, but you can't quit. And I think that's really however you do that, right? Whether you do that with a smile on your face or a scowl, or like you like just have visions of like kids you didn't like growing up. I'm not saying that's me. This isn't therapy. I'm just saying Kevin Gerlecki, I'm going to find you. So that's an actual person. He'd enjoy that. He'd laugh because he stole all my baseball cards growing up. I'm not bitter.
Oh man.
Sorry. So Shelli, I'm sorry. I feel like I cut you off a couple times, and I'd like to stop talking now.
I'm so curious because talent is critical in any business, but when you're dealing with a startup, every time you add one person, it can change the dynamics of everything. So I'm very curious, Kristi, how you've built out your team. What are some of those core attributes that you look for in your hires? And maybe what are some mistakes you've potentially made, or what are some of the best hires that you've made?
Yeah, you are so right, Shelli. And of course, you would get this more than I would, even just with your background and what you do for a living. And you do it very, very well. And as an entrepreneur, you don't get to hire the Shelli yet. You have to wait until you're a much bigger organization to hire someone who's amazing at identifying talent for your organization. So you have to wear that hat. And what we did about 3 years in is we identified 6 values that we run the company on. And I sometimes cringe at even saying it because it sounds so cliche. Everyone's like, oh, I got these values and we, run the company by this and what, but we really do. We have 6 values that we run the company on, and we don't forget about them. We have them posted in our main meeting room that we meet with the whole company every Monday morning. And at the end, we do a company stand up. And at the end of the company stand up, we take 10 minutes to give appreciations based on people living out values inside of our organization. So, for example, I might say, I want to recognize Sam and appreciate her for being customer obsessed last week. She absolutely crushed the renewal with this client and et cetera. And we do that to each other every Monday morning. And we've now taken those values and we interview based on those values. So we do a skills interview, of course, for anyone we're hiring into whichever role that we're hiring them into. But after, and sometimes even before they go through the skills interview, we interview them based on the values. So each person in the company, or we'll have 3 people take 2 values, and their whole job is to interview someone based on the 2 values that we've assigned to that interviewer. And so if they don't pass the values, the section, we don't hire them, which can be brutal for someone, especially if they're like an amazing engineer, for example. Developers are so hard to come by. They can make a huge exponential impact on your organization if they're a fantastic developer, but they can also bring down your entire organization if they don't match your values. And so it's so hard. And we have turned away and not given offers to amazing salespeople, amazing engineers, and amazing client success people because they just didn't fit with our values. And so I think that's been a real key to creating the culture and making sure that we've hired the right people. Now, we have for sure not hired the right people who we've even interviewed through the values system. And it's mostly been due to not seeing maybe the grit that was claimed they had in the interview, or not understanding, or they get into the company and they realize they just don't have the passion for KnowledgeHound. And that's okay. But for us, recognizing it very quickly for the individual and for the company is really critical, so that they're not around for 6, 9 months to a year. And we then decide that we're both not a good fit for each other. It's assessing that pretty early so that both of us can move on with our careers and our company and make sure that neither of us are impacted in a significant way.
I think that's really powerful stuff, especially when you're trying to create that culture. So you mentioned the being customer obsessed. Is that my experience with core value driven organizations? There's usually like a primary, right? And then there's a lot of, and maybe I'm making some assumptions here, so forgive me. But if you mentioned customer obsessed, is there another one that you think is really an important aspect where you go, if they don't have this, they just can't work here?
Yeah, I think there's 2 other ones that I notice pop up a lot in our appreciations, which are team first and bias to action. So, team first is, it has to be all about how everyone wins instead of how that one individual wins. And especially in a startup, that's critical, because what ends up happening is you reorg 5 different times. Now I'm exaggerating a little bit, but things shift.
No, you're not. Right. And if you think there's a communication plan on those 5 reorgs, you're crazy. It's called lunch.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. All right. You're linebacker. I'm shifting to safety. I don't know really. Let's try it this afternoon. Right.
Exactly. I love it. It's been so true. And so you have to be team first. And then also bias to action. The worst is, oh my gosh, it drives me crazy when people want to pontificate for hours and days and weeks about how do we solve a problem. And I don't care. Let's come up with an idea, let's execute it and fail really fast, and then we'll go do the next one. But people who are afraid, who are paralyzed by this fear of failure, are not a good fit for KnowledgeHound, and probably not a good fit for smaller startups in general.
No, I see that all the time. I do talk to a lot to small startup CEOs as well. And I think there's a lot of folks out there that really don't understand what it's like to work in an environment like that. I think they aspire and they find it interesting. But the way I describe it to people is it's like driving down the street with your head out the window, right? Like everything's coming at you at a million miles. You're picking bugs out of your teeth, right? It's like, and luckily it's raining too, right? So, and I think there's a certain personality type that enjoys that type of environment. So as you're growing, and you start hitting some of those numbers where, I went through this with my my last company where, you go from a flat structure, which is a great and fun environment, right? Everybody's just scrappy and doing what they're supposed to do. Now, when you start moving to larger organizations, that management structure, from my experience, always seems to come in, right? And it's got to be there. Is that the phase that you're at right now? And is there things that you're doing to create, still retain that scrappiness? Because I think that's where the plateau happens, is you start bringing in management and you tilt a little bit too heavy on the over architecture on management. And, you got one person reporting to one person who reports to one person. You got and then that one person has 20 people reporting to them. I don't know. Is there any kind of experience like that you could share?
Yeah, we've kept our organization pretty flat. However, I actually, to spin it a little bit in a different direction, we've kept it pretty flat. And in a way, I wonder if that's discouraging, though, to our employees thinking, okay, well, what's my career progression here? Because we have been pretty conscious of that, is how do you make sure there aren't layers? And how do we make sure we operate in the most efficient way? At the same time, if you've been at KnowledgeHound for 3 years, you kind of go, okay, well, when do I get to take that manager role? Or, what's my next move? And so I do think it's a delicate balance. Communication becomes harder with a larger organization and with layers, for sure. And we've gone through some growing pains on that. I'm actually talking with my executive coach right now on how do I make sure that the key messages for what I want to communicate to the organization are constantly and consistently being communicated throughout the entire organization. And we're only 21 employees. So if it's that like that with 21 employees, I can't imagine what it's like at 60 and 100 and 300. And so it's hard. And with those layers come communication issues. And so, again, as a CEO, as a founder, you've evolved to CEO as best as you can. And then now as CEO, you have to you have to have that piece of pessimism. Now you have to gain a new skill of communicating a single message across a large organization to everyone, and make sure all of your executives are then communicating that down to everyone inside their organization. It really does become complex. And I've seen very flat organizations work really well. I've seen hierarchical organizations work very well. I'm not sure there's one way that's right or wrong, but I do agree that there's major implications to either way that you choose. And you have to be agile and recognize those issues when they arise. I don't know if that makes sense or answers your question, but
Yeah, it totally does. And like where you're at right now with that, 15 to 25 is like the worst case scenario, right? Because you're not big enough to actually go have like a full-time manager for some of those things
right.
where it's like, no, I can't have a
Yeah,
manager of one person. But you're also not small enough where, having a meeting with the
right.
company is called
Yeah,
lunch.
you're exactly
Right.
right. Yeah.
And so you're kind of, and this is that place where you're in the middle of the river and it's like, I just got to keep
Yes.
going.
Right.
Right.
And I think Shelli could probably talk to this a little bit too, is that right at this point, a lot of times you're hiring for player coach roles. So you have to find someone who's willing to not only be the manager of the team, but also execute. And that's hard, especially we see that within the sales organization and the engineering organization. So you, as a salesperson at KnowledgeHound, you can't not be leading one or two deals yourself. And you have to do that. And then also you have to manage. And same thing with engineering. Our VP of engineering, he writes code. So I don't know, Shelly, if you have more to add with that, but I feel like you and I have had a lot of conversations about tech talent and how do you find a player coach, and when do they actually graduate to being not a player?
No, that's really interesting because we actually hire the same way here. And we look for grit, we look for bias for action. In fact, that's one of our core attributes that we hire for. So even though we have many professionals who've come out of large organizations, we make sure during the interview process that they are going to be both very strategic as well as roll up their sleeves, get in the weeds with everyone, and they want to make an impact. So it sounds very similar to Knowledge Hound.
Absolutely.
One thing I would submit though is there's the concept that, as you're going through this evolution when you're starting out a small business and you're whether it's internally or externally, you've got a visionary, and generally what the visionary is looking for is a lot of people who are operators, people who do, right? They execute. They don't
Yep.
require a lot of guidance or management. They just, and there's a certain amount of error that's acceptable in that space, right? You're still testing a lot of things. You're trying a lot of things. You're still doing a lot of experimentation and trying to find that product market fit. So it's okay, right, to have a little bit of the slop. And then you start getting to, this one great book calls it the fun phase, where you start selling and everything's flowing and you're growing. And you've got this cadre of operators that really were high functioning, and they've been through that first 3 years, and they've got the battle scars, and they're grizzled veterans, right? And
Right.
they know what they're doing.
Right.
And as you're growing, you start bringing on some of the people who, as much as you try to transfer that culture, right? Those hero stories, those remember when, we took that shot and it worked out, and like those things are embedded into your rituals and your traditions. But then management, that whole management conversion, some of the folks that were there aren't going to make that transfer,
Right.
right? They're not going to be there because that's just not who they are,
Right.
right? They don't want that. They don't want to be put into a pen or some kind of construct. They're just operators, and so I do think there's some of that is just a natural evolution of like, hey, this is the time for you to go, right? And it's like, this isn't, where the organization's going, because the fun ends up hitting what they call this whitewater phase of you're making a lot of mistakes. Clients are starting to say no. You're starting to have some people who, used to be advocates are now like, hey, do you not even care about me anymore? And so then you fall into the other side where it's like over management. And that's generally when the founder leaves, because it's no longer fun and everything's turning into like a death knell.
Yeah.
And so there's a big cycle there. I forget the name of the book, but it does really draw out the different types of personalities that you need from that raw startup phase of like, how do we take something that doesn't exist? And I don't have time or money for management. You've just got to help me figure it out. Right. And there's certain people, and I think back in those phases, you do a better job hiring then, only because the only people who take the job are the crazy ones, which
Yeah.
is what you
Yeah.
need. So it's almost like a self-filter of like, okay, I'm just going to make clear how hard this is going to hurt. And you either want the job or it's not a good fit. Well, and I think the management component's a real thing where it's like, a visionary person who's action oriented and wants to get out and do things is going to be reticent. I speak for myself as well, reticent to put any more management structure than absolutely,
Yeah.
necessary.
Yeah.
And but it's also a limiting component as you're growing, because you hit that whitewater and you're up and down and you're losing clients and losing money, and projects or clients, or the revenue's not where it needs to be to sustain or to reinvest.
Yep. Back on kind of what you said at the beginning of that was, it's a harsh reality and it stinks, especially for an optimist, where you're hiring people and you're like, you know what, the potential here, you could become I'm making this up, but you could become the CTO of this organization, and because they could. But most people should never become a CTO. Most people should never become a COO. Most people should never become a CEO. I'm only CEO because I founded the company. I just get default CEO, which isn't necessarily fair. But, and so your hope for those people is that they grow into that. The bummer is when you both realize the skill set, or one of you realizes that their skill set will never, they're not the right person to be in that role. And that was hard for me to realize coming into this, is that there's going to be people who have aspirations for themselves and they want to achieve certain things, but it's not the right move for them, or it's not the right, they don't have the right skill set.
It's not the right time.
Or it's not the
They're
right
not ready
time.
for it.
Right. Exactly. They're too early in their career, or exactly. So it's really hard to have that conversation with people. And even for me, like, I want everyone to succeed and fulfill their dreams. And I'm even bummed out when it happens, So and that's something I never thought about before founding a company and having to face it head to head. I never thought about, oh, that would happen someday. And it has happened a lot inside KnowledgeHound in particular. And yeah, so I think it's a really interesting point that people often don't talk about.
Well, and I think when you're a founder and you're a startup, you can typically only afford to hire where you're at currently within your business, not where you anticipate being in 3 to 5 years, right? And Kristi, I just want to recognize, because I know that you are so incredibly humble. You're 40 under 40. You're one of the most recognized women in tech here in Chicago and beyond. Just curious, what you feel about the scene here in Chicago for women in technology. What resources, groups are out there? What is some advice that you might give to our listeners?
Yeah, I think Chicago has been great or has a lot of support for females entrepreneurs in Chicago. So no complaints there. There's a couple organizations that I have leveraged or I'm a part of to mentor. One is WTF, Women Tech Founders. They do a great job of creating a community with women and resources and men, which I think is really important that all of these organizations that I'm talking about accept men into their organization. We need men to help us move the needle forward. And so you have access, though, to mentors, you have access to each other as resources, but mentorship as well. So Women Tech Founders is one. So WTF. Another is Wisdom, which is out of 1871. And they're actually an accelerator for women in tech. And if you've got a business idea, you can submit it and go through the program, and they will walk you through the critical steps that it takes to get your business from concept phase to actually functioning. And then there's Forward, FWD, which is a great resource as well for women and men. That is all about how do we advance women forward in the startup scene, in the entrepreneurial scene. And again, they have lots of resources. They do conferences that have great content that can help you understand, okay, how do I get from, A to B? And okay, now I'm at this stage, what do I do? So there's a lot of resources here. I think what's been the most impactful for me is just having personal mentors.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say very important is that you have both male and female mentors, because again, the men are the ones who are having the success. And so we need them to bring us along for the ride and help us get there as well. And so I have found so many supportive men, and I think most of them don't even look at me as a male or a female. They look at me as an entrepreneur that they're mentoring. And that is so critical. And I know some of them who have even said, like, hey, I feel like you're my daughter. Like, I want to help you. And, that definitely has a gender connotation to it, but in a really positive way. And so Chicago's a very friendly ecosystem of people wanting to help each other. And we need to capitalize on that as an ecosystem.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to wrap this up, and the idea that nobody gets very far on their own. We all need help.
Yes.
Don't be shy to offer, and don't even be less shy to ask, because I think that's the real problem is there is a lot of resources, a lot of people out there with a lot of experience, and they'd love to share it have value to the next generation. And too often we don't knock on the door and just ask for a moment of time. But I think that's a great place to close. And so, Kristi, I really want to say thanks for taking the time to talk with us today.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
So we also wanted to thank our listeners. We really appreciate everyone taking the time to join us today.
And if you'd like to receive new episodes as they're published, you can subscribe by visiting our website at dragonspears.com/podcast, or find us on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
This episode was sponsored by Dragon Spears and produced by Dante32.